Remembrance Day.
Call the member for Ryan.
Mr Speaker, I move the motion relating to Remembrance Day in the terms in which it appears on the notice paper.
Is the motion seconded?
I second the motion.
And reserve your right to speak. Thank you. The member for Ryan.
Mr Speaker, this Wednesday, the 11th of November, is Remembrance Day and marks the 97th anniversary of the armistice which ended World War I. In the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, we pause to commemorate Australians who died or suffered in all wars and armed conflicts. Mr Speaker, clearly the world has changed beyond recognition since the early decades of the 20th century. With the passage of time, we have seen the last of the survivors of World War I pass on. 97 years may have passed, but their service has not been forgotten. As Australians, we owe it to the men and women who enlisted, who served and who gave their lives fighting for our nation to preserve their memory and to honour their sacrifice. And honour them we do. The exploits of Australian servicemen during the First World War have rightfully become part of Australian folklore. In particular, the bravery of the diggers on the shores of Gallipoli came to define the identity of our nation. The Army barracks located in my electorate was renamed Gallipoli Barracks in honour of those who served and died in that conflict. This is just one of many such tributes around the country, and I commend the ongoing work of the Australian War Memorial under the directorship of Dr Brendan Nelson for keeping the Anzac memory alive. Mr Speaker, the war weighed heavily on the resources of our young nation. It is fascinating to go back through Hansard to read about the extent of preparations for the war effort. For example, on the 14th of April in 1915, the then Prime Minister Andrew Fisher provided a detailed update to the House on the equipment required to clothe and arm Allied forces across the Commonwealth. The requisitioning of the output of 22 mills to provide the wool for the uniforms. The supply of 2 million yards of cloth for jackets, more than 1 million yards of flannel for shirts and blankets, and the supply of 1 million pairs of boots. Much of this burden was borne by Australia, a nation just 14 years old and home to a population of less than 5 million people, less than a quarter of what we are today. On the 29th of April 1915, the Minister for Defence confirmed to Parliament for the first time that Australian forces had landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. That minister was Sir George Pearce, a senator from Western Australia and my great-grandfather. On the day of the original armistice, 11th of November 1918, he was once again Minister for Defence, albeit under a new Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, World War I exacted a terrible human toll on our nation. More than 60,000 men and women lost their lives in the conflict, and a further 156,000 were wounded, gassed or taken prisoner. The death and dislocation caused by the war was so great that the Bureau of Statistics figures show the population of Australia declined in 1915 and again in 1916, the first and to date only years in post-Federation recorded history that this has occurred. I use the term recorded history advisedly because at the time most Indigenous Australians were not recorded in census statistics, nor were they permitted the right to vote. Nevertheless, the Australian War Memorial estimates that more than 1,000 Indigenous Australians fought in the First World War. Many more attempted to enlist but were denied on the grounds of race, and those who managed to successfully enlist enjoyed equal pay and generally equal treatment to other soldiers, a rarity at the time. Sadly, equal treatment was not extended in the post-war period, and it would be 5 more decades until Indigenous Australians were accorded equal rights under the Australian Constitution. Mr Speaker, as the motion notes, in terms of the number of deaths and casualties, the First World War remains the most costly conflict in Australian history. I am sure that it is the fervent wish of all Australians that its human toll is never surpassed. History recalls that the world did not fully heed the lessons of the First World War and was doomed to repeat the cycle of destruction a generation later in the Second World War. Even in these relatively more peaceful times, war and conflict remains a fact of life for millions of people worldwide. On this Remembrance Day, like all others, we should pause to reflect on the memory of those Australians who have died in wars and armed conflicts. A grateful nation honours their sacrifice, and their legacy is a safer and more peaceful world, lest we forget.